We've been asking questions all along. Does anybody have any questions as far as anything else? Yeah.
What about adding like oat bran or rice bran as a fungal food at a small amount?
Yeah.
I've heard of people separating the brown material into what they call a carbohydrate and a pure carbon. And there's some balance between carbohydrates and pure carbon material being saprophytic fungi foods. And I know Elaine Ingham talked about adding oats.
To the compost pile?
To a pile, yeah.
Yeah.
Pat's got some, those are steel cut oats that you have mixed in. Is that correct?
John Nelson here and Rocco made the compost, and they made really good compost that had a little bit of fungi and a lot of fungal spores, right?
Yep.
Yeah. And that's because we have to turn it to get the process to further reduce pathogens to be legal. And so in doing that, we keep chopping up the fungi. So yeah, you get it to grow, but it keeps getting killed. And so at the end, it's been knocked back pretty hard. And so we have all these spores. And so to try and get the fungi in the matrix we're going to use for making the tea, we added humates, fish hydroslate, and steel cut oats. And then just this time, we also, well, no, actually this time we did it to the tea, but before I've added also aloe vera, because U-Level says that's good for getting the fungal growth too. And you see a lot of fungi. I don't know if they are really the fungi we're looking for. You know, you see all the mycelia when we did it, but I mean, and you have your thoughts on why that didn't work for you, right?
Yeah, well, I don't like to spend any money on what I'm putting into my compost pile, and you're having to spend money on, most likely having to spend money on oats or steel cut oats or whatever to put in there.
To be clear, we do not put oats in our compost pile. The tea matrix, we take our compost, and we took Dan's compost, and the week before we're going to make tea, we then feed that compost again to try to raise the levels of fungi to get those spores to germinate and start growing in there. So we do not put that would be ridiculous to buy steel cut oats to put in your compost.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's not a good plan.
Talking about like
Yeah.
animal feed or like a byproduct of the oat industry or rice or wheat industry.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be that important personally, you know. It's going to go so fast. I mean, that's the whole problem trying to get fungal compost is this process of composting goes through the carbon so fast. Wood chips and that really recalcitrant carbon is about all you really have that works, you know. Everything else is gone in the first, 5 days or something? 10 days or something like that, you know. So to me, it'd be a waste to put it in compost.
2 questions. Is there a way to test nitrogen levels at home? And how do you store your browns until you have enough greens?
You can buy nitrogen testers, and I can't remember exactly how they work, but they have these little handheld testers that I think you use strips with. It's been a long time since I messed with that.
So maybe.
Yeah, you should be able to. Nitrogen levels fluctuate rapidly in the soil, so it's...
Do you want more like a carbon to nitrogen ratio tester or coffee?
Some people like to get super technical with figuring all that out. I don't worry about it. I just kind of go by like percentages and like size of materials and like not having too much wood chips that are going to take a long time to break down. You know, diversity mixture of brown material. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because I meant to bring that up before. So a lot of times people on a home scale, I kind of mentioned it on a larger scale, but on a home scale, you know, you don't have enough, you have a good amount of browns. Like in the fall, you rake up all your leaves and you've got a big, huge pile of leaves, but then at that point in time, you don't have green stuff. So if you've got a bunch of brown stuff or a bunch of green stuff and you need to wait for the other to balance it out. So like at the beginning of the year, if you're at a home gardener, you could start throwing your green stuff into a pile and throw your brown stuff into a pile. And then when you had enough to add together that's going to make enough thermal mass to create a 4 cubic feet compost pile, then you would mix all that together. And depending on how long it's been sitting there, you probably would want to add some high nitrogen to it to get it going.
Okay. So when you say add, just pile up your green stuff,
all I'm thinking of is like wet, soggy vegetables.
Yeah, so...
But are you thinking of something that's drier?
Yes, I was going to address that as well.
Okay.
So a lot of time, most of the green stuff you're going to have, like she was mentioning, is food waste, and you can't necessarily like dump a bunch of food waste out, in a pile and have it like stay healthy. So a great way to handle that on a home scale is to, and I've done this, take a hardware cloth like one of these and get some wood chips, and then you can fill one of these halfway with wood chips, and then as you have home food waste, like you put a bucket in your house and make dinner and get all your lettuce and cucumbers and carrots and stuff like that, and then once you fill that bucket up, take it out to your wood chip pile. So if you fill it halfway up with wood chips, then you can come out with your bucket of food waste and bury a pocket here, and then come out, a few days later or next week and have a little pocket here. And so you just create all these little pockets where you're burying your food waste and making sure that it's covered up. And if you need to, you can mark with flags or mark where you're putting your food waste so you don't double up in an area. So you just want to fill all these with little pockets of food waste, and it's getting covered by carbon so that you're keeping smells and vectors down. Once you fill all that up, this is how I started it. Then you can come out, this is covered with wood chips. Then you come out, dump some, covered it with a little bit of wood chips, dump some, covered it with a little bit of wood chips. I mean, this is going to take a while because as you're doing this and the months go by, this level's going to go down to here because it's going to decompose and you're going to have smaller sizes. Anyway, dumping food waste, covering it with wood chips, dumping food waste, covering with wood chips, working your way up. The only issue with this is that you now have all of your finished compost at the bottom of the pile, and this is going to be several months older on the bottom than the stuff that's on the top. And so what happens is you have to take off your ring and then dig off the top half to get the good stuff on the bottom. That's the only issue with that. So that's one way of doing it. Or you can bury it all in the same way. Sorry, I misspoke. You can do it like this and do static composting, which is what most people do in their home, where you're leaving a pile of compostable materials to sit for a year or two, and it's breaking down over a year or two, and then after that year, you've got compost that's ready to go. If you're wanting to have compost in a quicker fashion, you could do the thermophilic composting, where you're doing the same process of putting food waste into here just to keep it safe, stink-free, and aerobic. And then when you get enough material of this, then you could take some chicken manure or whatever high nitrogen and add it in there to kick the party off and get that to start thermophilic composting and start your thermophilic process and go through what I discussed earlier in the day for thermophilic composting and manage it that way.
Would bamboo be considered green?
It would be considered brown. Well, it depends on the age, but most of it's going to be considered brown stuff.
You're saying if we had, like we have goats, so if we took the goat poop and hay and left it in a pile for over a year, it would compost itself and then we could start using that.
Yes, but because of the poop and hay having urea in it, it's going to be super high nitrogen, and so you would want to add some brown stuff in with that. Otherwise, it's just too much nitrogen, and you're probably going to have a mess. So that when people compost food waste in any way, using worms or anything, the main issue that they have is that they put too much green material into it, and they get a soupy mess, and they needed to have added carbon along while they're adding food waste. So when I've got a bucket in my house for composting food waste, I usually use a smaller bucket than this, but I will get the free newspapers, like when you go to the grocery store and you're walking on your way out and they have like the stacks of free newspapers that nobody usually takes anyway. I grab a handful of those and keep them next to my compost bin. And then when I start with a fresh food waste bin, I rip it up into strips similar to what like a shredder would do when you put it through a shredding machine. And I make a layer on the bottom that's 1 to 2 inches thick. And then I put food waste in there, and then so I'm on a smaller scale. I'm doing what I just told you. So in my house, I'm putting in food waste, covering it with carbon, food waste, covering it with carbon, food waste, covering it with carbon, and then that goes out and gets covered with carbon again. So that's why you actually, the ratios of it, you end up having a good amount of carbon in the material.
Somehow or another, I always heard a great source of brown was cardboard, but recently I've been getting a whole bunch of juice pulp from a place that does fresh juices, and then the cardboard says that it's got certain insecticides and fungicides in the cardboard. And then I went online, and I guess a lot of the big cardboard that is even in anything that's shipped, they put fire retardants in it. And I didn't know if that was like negligible as it's breaking down, or if that will actually be in your compost.
That's new to me. I have not heard of that. I'm glad to have heard about that. So it sounds like what you're talking about is actually corrugated. There's a difference between corrugated and cardboard. Cardboard's actually what you make like cereal boxes out of, whereas corrugated is what you get your Amazon stuff sent to you in. And I imagine you're talking about corrugated. If it were to be labeled like that, then no, you would not want to include that into your pile. If that's what you're asking.
Yes. If, I guess I was just wondering if that would. It probably wouldn't just compost out into nothing, but
it would have I would be afraid that it had. What is it? What is getting shipped in this?
In produce boxes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I imagine it's because there's issues that the produce could be carrying with them that they're trying to keep down as it's being shipped around. So, yeah, it's likely to have an effect on the biology that you're putting it in with, and I would be scared to include anything like that in my pile. Yeah, since it's got fungicide.
Yeah.
You mean like the banana boxes?
Banana boxes, peach boxes, any kind of apple boxes, or any of that. They say it's like a food grade beeswax.
Yeah.
That they put the they put the fungicide in there, and then a wax over that.
Okay. The waxy stuff you would think that it would be hard to compost stuff with a waxy residue, but at the large-scale composting facility I worked at, we got in Copenhagen chewing tobacco. Some chewing tobacco companies use plastic canisters, and some use cardboard. It's a cardboard-like material. I don't know exactly what it is. It's compostable, but they're covered with wax because the tobacco that goes in there is moist, so they got to keep the paper away from the moisture so that it doesn't rot down. The wax will go away. I've seen that. You wouldn't think that you'd think that the waxy stuff would take a long time to decompose, but through turning and the heat and everything involved, the wax wears away rather quickly and gets decomposed with that type of material. But yeah, it would be a concern having any fungicide or anything like that.
You haven't mentioned anything about wood ash? Adding that to the compost?
Yeah, wood ash is going to add potassium, but if you get too much wood ash, there are salts. When you burn stuff, you get an accumulation of salts, and so you can overdo it. And I don't know what the tipping point is. I mean, it would kind of be dependent on what you burned, but you just don't. Yeah, you want to keep it pretty minimal. But I do add some wood. I've got a wood burning stove that I use as my only source of heat at home, so some of that I do take out and put in my compost pile just for added nutrients. Not a lot. Yeah, I'll just like throw a little dust on the top and allow it to soak down with rain.
Yeah, you talk about the newspapers. Are you worried about the ink?
No. So most any newspaper nowadays is printed with soy-based ink, and as long as it's soy-based, yeah. There's in this day and age, I don't know. Do you know, Rhonda, if anything is printed with toxic inks anymore?
Certainly not newspaper.
Yeah.
But it maybe sometimes in magazines
Right.
or, heavy metals in the place that
Yeah.
we use.
So the glossy stuff is you don't really want to use, just the newspaper type paper material.
Yes.
I had a question about the static aerated piles. So that outer zone that doesn't live in the heat, do you have to take that off when you then go to use it?
I neglected to mention, thank you for asking that, because I neglected to mention, I did not do this, but most people use a blanket layer of used finished compost. I didn't mean to say used, finished compost on top of that, so you're insulating it with finished compost, and then you're by using finished compost, you're not wasting anything, because then your inside material is going to finish, and then once you pull it all out, you've got nothing but compost.
Okay. And I was at a presentation and they were talking about like having finished compost in 15 days with a static aerated pile. And then you're talking 4 or 6 months.
I mean, so...
And just for reference, it was the system at Warren Wilson College.
Yeah. We were having a discussion about this last night, because there's different things that say they get finished compost in a month or whatever, and it may have gone through the composting process and have met PFRPs, but it doesn't mean it's finished compost. It's most likely hot. Yeah, there's a lot of places that seem to sell hot compost. If you watch Instagram and see like people get compost deliveries, I see this different times. They're like, ooh, I got my compost delivery today. And then you watch it and it's steaming, and it's like, if that's steaming, it's obviously hotter than ambient temperature, and it's probably gonna burn your plants. Yeah, it's still composting. It's still got energy to burn up. Yeah. Yes?
Why are fungi important?
Why are fungi important? Fungi in the ground, in the soil, do lots of things. Referring to this, what I was talking about with succession before, fungi is important in the soil in that the form of nitrogen that they produce is going to be different than what the form of nitrogen that bacteria produce. So there's a difference between like ammonium and nitrates. And fungi produce more ammonium, which more plants use. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, as a background, I grow mushrooms. Yeah, so oyster mushroom farm. We produce like 1,500 pounds per week of spent substrate. And we're running at a 1/10 of the capacity, so we're going to be producing a lot. And we would like to utilize the spent substrate, but it would be a great news if the fungi, the oyster mushroom, mycelium, was a great addition to the soil. But I'm not sure about that because, you talked about succession, but I don't think that fungi. I don't think fungi changes the plants. I think it's the other way around. So the more trees, the more lignin and hard materials for the fungi to utilize. So I don't think it's the fungi changing the plant. The plant changes the fungi.
Yes, it works both ways. The plants are establishing, plants always dictate the biology, which therefore dictates the chemistry in the soil too. Yes, so the plants, from my understanding, like at first when you're only growing weeds, then you only have bacterial food, but then as your plants go along in succession, then those plants are going to be the foods that fungi want, and so they're going to move into the soil more and feed off of that. So it works both ways, but yeah, it's like the chicken and the egg question, kind of.
So do you think that oyster mushroom mycelium would work for a fungal compost?
Yes, it would help to have more fungi. So it's complicated because you want diversity, and so when you have something like that, you've only got one type of fungi in the system, but it is beneficial. And also, I have a friend who owns a mushroom business, and I've looked at his spent substrate, and it was full of nematodes, like lots of nematodes. So it had really good biology in there.
Button mushrooms or oyster mushrooms?
He does oyster and shiitake, and I think that stuff, the substrate was from his oysters. He was either oyster or lion mane. He also does lion mane. Any other questions before we move on?
Southern pine beetle, adalgia, these type of things. Do you consider those woods to be diseased in the sense of making compost?
Can you repeat the first part of your question?
Well, just give me a couple quick examples. I own a lot of forest land. Southern pine beetle, algae for the hemlocks, and I can go on. Are those considered, would that wood not be suitable for composting?
Yeah, he was asking about the southern pine beetle and algae, an issue with some type of algae.
The adelgid,
They actually are killing those trees.
the woolly adelgid is
But they
Oh,
use these
a little
they
bug.
leave the tree though. You know.
Yeah, my understanding would be that if you're putting that stuff through the thermophilic process, that those things are gonna get killed. I would
think it's not a problem.
Right. Yeah, it always becomes questionable with things like that, that I'm not gonna be able to give you the correct answer to that, so I don't exactly know, and I don't wanna give you the wrong answer. Yeah.
As far as the food waste that you would add to your compost, is it better to get food waste of a lot of diversity, or is it okay to go to like an orchard and get a lot of peaches or apples of one thing and put that in?
To me, it's just, I mean, it's always better to have diversity, but we're trying to make a resource out of waste, so whatever waste that you have,
Yeah, I'm just all the ones that fall on the ground, you know, that they're not using.
Yeah, either compost them or just let them rot in place, because they have pulled stuff out of the ground through the tree that needs to be replenished back into the soil. So either compost them and put those nutrients and minerals back into the soil through that compost, or just let them rot in place. Because if you've got good biology in the soil, they should be.
Well, if you were trying to take that off-site to another farm, is what I'm saying. And not necessarily for those trees, but for just making compost.
Yeah, it's always better to have diversity, but it's fine. Yeah. And yeah, people also ask about like native microorganisms and things with like food waste. And I'm like, well, you know, you're buying bananas from South America. Those aren't going to be native microorganisms. So did I answer your question as much as I could?
I've heard not to use lots of citrus or citrus peels in compost. Is there a reason for that, or is that just?
Yeah, it depends on what type of composting you're doing. There's some type of acid, and I always forget this, but I believe it's an acid that's in citrus that has harmful effects on worms. And Rhonda would be a better one to ask about that after the class. On a large scale, it's really not that big of a deal to have citrus in piles or onions. And I don't know the source of it, but there's a little picture that goes around on Facebook about somewhere, I think it's in South America, where they kept dumping all those oranges. And then you see it like 2 years later and it's like this lush. Yeah, so like, I kind of point to that. It's like, well, it's organic matter that's going back to the earth. Yeah.
Yes.
How does biochar affect the biology?
She asked how biochar affects the biology. I'm not an expert at biochar, and from all the things that I've gathered and listened to about it, biochar provides a home for microorganisms, which is good in a way, but I've heard that if you use, I believe the figure was 20%. There was a guy that was talking that they had done some research, and I believe it was on a podcast, I believe it was 20%. If you use more than 20%, you're giving so much habitat for microorganisms that they prefer the biochar and the habitat of the biochar as a food, and so then they won't do the work that you want because they're stuck in the they're like, oh, we like it here. That's just what I've heard. I'm not saying that's correct. That's
More than 10% recommended.
okay. I couldn't remember if it was 10 or 20. I'm glad that you clarified. Any other? Yes.
A comment too, to be aware, if you're making compost, you want to be sure your skills are really good and that you actually hit PFRP if you're going to be adding char, because I've learned the hard way that microbes like the harborage of char, including the pathogens. So you can have recalcitrant pathogens. I mean, most of those pathogens should be gone just sitting in a pile for a year. I got to be there 3 years later when I got some compost that hadn't been properly made that had char in it.
That's a good point. Did everyone hear that? He was saying that it could be a downfall in having put biochar in there if you have pathogens, because the material could then hold on to those pathogens for a longer period of time. So you got to be aware if you're not composting correctly. You want to make sure that everything's going through PFRPs, high temperatures. This is the end of this presentation. I've got the same information on my other presentation. This is my email and website and social media. We'll move on to our compost tea part of the presentation here.